Good afternoon. I'm Alan Matisow, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to today's event, which is a lecture by a member of our own faculty, David Cook. David has, in a very short time, become an important voice in the national discussion that we're having about Islam and its meaning for us as a people. He is a scholar, and he speaks with the authority of a scholar. He actually began his journey as a scholar intending to study archaeology, and he went to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem to study that subject. And a year later, he switched to Arab language and literature. Got his degree in 1994. And went to University of Chicago to study religion at the graduate level. He got his degree there, his PhD degree, in 2001 on the basis of his dissertation on the origins of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries. Since he's joined the faculty, in a very few years, he's been extremely productive. He's got 3 books, which are studies in Muslim Apocalyptic, 2002, Contemporary Muslim Apocalyptic Literature, 2005, and a second book in 2005 called Understanding Jihad. He's completed a manuscript called Martyrdom in Islam, and you can be certain that that will be published in due course. I wrote him an email yesterday asking him where he's been to study this subject. The remarkable thing about David Cook is that he doesn't simply go to the library, though he spends a lot of time there, to study the subjects that he studies. He is traveling, and traveling a lot in Islamic countries, talking to religious scholars, talking to journalists, talking to officials, at no inconsiderable risk to himself. So I asked him where he had been, and so he replied in an email. He said, "I've traveled to Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, Yemen, Chad, Kenya, Tanzania, Singapore, Morocco, Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Nigeria, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh." This summer he was in Kabul, and he says that I talked to the official organization of Afghani ulama, the religious scholars. Despite the name, they are basically pro-Taliban. He talked to people in the Ministry of the Interior, recently suicide bombed, the ulama in Herat, including the official imam of the city and other officials throughout northern Afghanistan, ministers of the Interior, and Ismail Khan, the former warlord of Herat, and others. There was a riot in Kabul at the end of May, and David was on the street, found himself in the middle of it. Fortunately, a kindly person walked him to safety, and he survived that in the hotel. He told me today, has a diary, so there are probably many stories like that. The point about, as I say, about David is he speaks with the authority of a scholar who's been in the library, but more than that, he's a single-minded scholar on a mission that has required considerable personal courage. And we are very fortunate that he is here today, alive, to talk to us on the subject, Policy Responses to Suicide Attacks by Radical Muslims. So welcome David Cook to the podium.
Thank you. I would also like to thank the Baker Institute for funding so many of those travels, and also their kindness in allowing me to speak on the subject again. A year ago, I presented actually on the first element of the research here, So I'm not going to cover exactly the same material as I did a year ago, which was focusing a little bit more on the legal and religious aspects of suicide attacks. But actually today I'm going to focus a little bit more on the operational aspects, and hopefully then get to the issue of the policy recommendations that myself and my associate Olivia Allison have written now in our book, which is going to come out sometime next year. Before I start off, I'd like to be very careful about defining what I mean by a suicide attack, which is usually called a martyrdom operation in Arabic, and categorize it according to the research that I've made, which is that it's an operation that needs, by necessity, the person who carries it out has to die. Now, there are different other types of suicidal operations in which a given fighter, for example, can carry out a mission that might seem suicidally brave, perhaps even with the expectation that he won't come back from it. But there's always the problem that he might actually be captured, or perhaps something might go wrong. A suicide operation, by its very necessity, demands that the first person who dies is actually the person who's bringing, let's say, an explosive into a given area. So the form in which that takes usually is some sort of a strap-on bomb, or perhaps a vehicle bomb, and these things are extremely common really throughout the history. The second thing that I would like to do definitionally is focus upon those particular types of attacks that are most likely to affect the United States. Now, from our point of view, there's quite a number of different suicide groups that employ suicide operations throughout the world, the most prominent of which actually is not Muslim, the LTTE of Sri Lanka, which has been employing suicide attacks really since the middle 1990s, with quite a good deal of efficaciousness. However, the research pretty much leads one to the conclusion that this is not actually a danger to the United States. This group has focused its entire violence upon the Sinhalese majority of Sri Lanka rather than any United States functions. And so what I'm going to do, first of all, is take a look at suicide attacks as they've developed among radical Muslims, and then focus most specifically upon those that are likely to have some sort of influence against the United States. Now, suicide attacks first came to the attention of the United States really through the 1983 bombings against the United States forces in Beirut, Lebanon, when the United States, together with France and Italy, was occupying part of the city and trying to enforce a certain agreement that would have led to both Israeli and Christian hegemony within Lebanon. And there were quite a number of different groups in Lebanon for which that was fundamentally unacceptable. And so in October of 1983, we find the first major suicide attack against the United States. There had been others prior to that time, but with military significance, in which Marines were attacked in Beirut. And this was followed subsequently by attacks against the French occupation forces and also the Israeli occupation forces. Now, all of these were fundamentally of a military nature. In other words, primarily soldiers died, and in great numbers. And they were all quite significant. 200 and some Marines died in the first Beirut operation, about 50 French soldiers, and then 74 Israeli soldiers in several different subsequent operations. But I would like to posit for you that actually suicide attacks primarily do not have military significance. Okay, and we're going to focus mostly upon suicide attacks as having political or social, or in the end, sometimes even religious significance, rather than actually military significance. And one of the pieces of evidence that I'd like to propose for your consideration to prove that is actually the continuing of suicide attacks by Hezbollah and its various different associates against the occupation forces of Israel in South Lebanon, in which we find this continually diminishing results pattern, especially going on through the late 1980s into the early 1990s. Hezbollah uses suicide attacks against Israeli forces. And in the end, they really don't achieve hardly anything other than the killing of the person that does them. Okay? And so by 1994, essentially Hezbollah had made an operational decision to cease the use of suicide operations. And we noticed that, actually, during the recent conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, no suicide operations were used, quite interestingly enough. But suicide operations then made a transition away from the Sunni world away from the Shiite world into the Sunni world, starting approximately from the early 1990s. There are two axes of penetration, one could say, where we find suicide attacks beginning to appear. One of which has to do with Palestinians that starting with 1994, begin to use suicide attacks against Israeli civilians on a large scale. Usually these are revenge operations for particular atrocities that the Israelis have carried out and so forth. And they have somewhat of a mixed reception among Palestinians. At certain times, Palestinians accept them as legitimate vengeance, but at certain different other times, Palestinians feel that they are exaggerated or that they are deliberately trying to derail various different peace negotiations. The other axis of penetration is through radical Muslims that are not connected with Israel at all. And so we start to find, starting with 1995, which is really kind of the key year for globalist radical Muslims, that we first find suicide attacks in Pakistan with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad movement that is later led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, who then later, at a later time, becomes one of Osama bin Laden's associates. And the use of several different abortive suicide attacks in Bosnia, also associated with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and then a few suicide attacks in Algeria that are associated with the radical Muslim revolt at that particular time. These things at that time seem rather atomistic and divorced from any Islamic reality. Most of them don't attract very much attention. They don't manage to kill very many people. And significantly, Ayman al-Zawahiri actually has to issue a very long and detailed circular to protect himself, to defend himself from attacks as to why on earth he's using these things. Okay, then starting from the year 2000, then we find a massive reappearance of suicide attacks within the Sunni world. Okay, focused mostly upon resistance or nationalist movements. Okay, most especially the Palestinians and the Chechens. Okay, at this particular time, the Chechen movements are gradually losing their independence to Russian reinvasion of Chechnya, which commences in 1999, continues on through 2000, etc. And so we begin to find the first Chechen suicide attacks in that year, and they culminate then by the year 2003, 2004, with massive suicide attacks against Russian civilians. At the same time, basically, the Second Intifada breaks out among Palestinians, and we find that there's a pattern of suicide attacks that begin towards the latter part of the year 2000 that begins to take serious shape by the middle of 2001. And there's a protracted suicide campaign that lasts between 2001 up until approximately 2003. Now, ideally, this is the sort of thing that one would try and pull off in order to maximize the suicide campaign, is a continual process of frightening the population against which it's directed. To date, that's really only happened with the Palestinians in Israel. Because of the close physical proximity of the two peoples, there was the possibility, actually, of a protracted suicide campaign that was mostly, at least for a time, a local initiative. Now, the Israelis, over a period of time, tried to profile likely suicide attackers, and significantly they failed. Every time there was a particular profile that was issued, first of all, it was mainly issued for young, unmarried males, in general, religious and so forth, somebody who has some sort of connection or reason for vengeance against Israel. Then the Palestinian organizations managed to come up with some type of variant on that particular paradigm that significantly skewed it, to the point where you eventually found women that were participating, maybe even very young children, and so eventually the Israelis were forced to say that there is no profile, which is the same conclusion that I think that United States should come to as well. Beyond this, then, starting in the late 1990s, we find that globalist radical Muslims under the authority of Al-Qaeda begin to use suicide attacks. And they basically become the paradigmatic method by which globalist radical Muslims seek to fight, is usually using martyrdom operations. Okay, the first one that they pull off is the attack on the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, and then they move on to the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen, and then of course to September 11th. Beyond that, I would put forth that we don't really find prominent operations that are closely associated with Al-Qaeda. For the most part, beyond September 11th, we're finding that the operations are basically farmed out, and so they're diffused among a wide range of local radical Muslim groups, some of which are closely affiliated with Al-Qaeda, some of which are ideologically similar but not necessarily affiliated, and some that are simply connected through idea diffusion. Okay, examples of those are the Indonesian Jemaah Islamiyah, a group that is sometimes said to be Al-Qaeda's Southeast Asian branch. Personally, I reject that interpretation. This is a group that has in the past sought to establish a Muslim state within the context of Indonesia, but it seems very clear now that actually the suicide attacks that began in 2002 with the prominent attack against the tourists at Bali were actually being carried out by a fairly small group within the Jemaah Islamiyah that had prematurely gone to a violent interpretation of its mission. Other groups that have some links with globalist radical Muslims, for example, in Kashmir, the long-standing religious and nationalist move towards some sort of independence or autonomy within Kashmir, primarily fighting against India, began to attract the use of suicide attacks. There hasn't been that much technical or strategically interesting operations. These are operations that don't attract very much attention. They're not easy to find. But they have actually started using women in the recent past, but have generally mixed in suicidal operations with suicide operations. So it's not always easy to tell the two apart. Other different Al-Qaeda branches that have used suicide attacks, for example, in Saudi Arabia, an affiliated group in Morocco in 2003, in Turkey repeatedly from 2004 and 2005, in East Africa, again, against Israeli tourists, and then a series of interesting suicide attacks that have taken place in Egypt, especially during 2004, 2005, and just recently. Now, we can't talk about suicide attacks without focusing quite a good deal upon Iraq. There's no question that Iraq, as far as suicide attacks, simply is beyond any other theater in terms of both technical innovation, sheer numbers, and people that have been killed. The usual estimate is that we've talked starting from around the year 2004, when suicide attacks really got moving in Iraq. that since then we've had about 540 suicide attacks, who, according to the estimates, have killed about 16,000 to 18,000 people. Now, the interesting thing about the suicide attacks in Iraq is that they have been, for the most part, once again, focused upon the Shiite community. Okay, and never once, at least until now, have the Shiites actually responded with a return suicide attack. Because this is highly interesting, because, and we'll return to this point when we talk a little bit about Pakistan, where also the suicide attacks have been focused completely upon the Shiite community without ever a counter response on the same sort coming from the Shiite community. But at any rate, in Iraq, we find that the previous Sunni domination of Iraq, which was destroyed by the American invasion in 2003, is then the counter response takes several different forms. Obviously, you have the very large element of resistance against American forces that is usually said to be focused upon the huge number of soldiers that the American army very foolishly kind of discharged after 2003, 2004, and have really been the cadres that have focused their attacks mostly upon the American army. These, from the point of view, the military point of view of the American army, are the ones that are the most deadly. But they are not the ones that are usually using the suicide attacks. The suicide attacks apparently are generally coming from groups that are, first of all, associated with Al-Qaeda, the so-called Al-Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, formerly headed by the late Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, and several different other less radical Sunni groups, one Ansar al-Sunnah, which has been a focus for a lot of different suicide attacks, and also members of the former Ba'athist regime, which have no interest in perpetrating the present-day regime. Okay, so there's a stark difference right there. From a military point of view, the ones that have been the most successful in attacking the United States forces, usually by means of roadside bombs, sniper action, or formal attacks, have not actually caused that many casualties to American troops. There have been a couple of notable suicide attacks that have been successful against the United States. But for the most part, as I say, the Iraqi experience has pretty much proven that that suicide attacks are not actually effective against a military that is prepared. They are effective against civilians, and civilians have indeed. The goal usually of the Iraqi resistance is said to be to cause a civil war between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And it seems very clear that goal has been realized. And the other focus for recent suicide attacks is Afghanistan. Afghanistan really, until 2005, hardly had any suicide attacks. There were a few suicide attacks that were focused upon the initial United States invasion in 2001. A very few minor ones during the years that intervened, but all of these were of a purely military nature, okay, and usually just killed the suicide attacker themselves and, let's say, one or two soldiers, and sometimes some civilians that were on the side. Since the middle of 2005, there have been 90 suicide attacks in Afghanistan. And especially since the beginning of this year, you see that they've been more and more focused upon the massive civilian casualty type of suicide attacks that you see in Iraq. Okay, these things can kill up to perhaps 20, 30 people, and are oftentimes deliberately focused upon desecrating sanctities. They will be focused upon mosques. One hit a funeral that was associated with a prominent leader in Afghanistan. One destroyed the entrance to the Interior Ministry, hardly a sanctity, but still someplace that I have to admit that I spent a little bit of time there. So, but anyway, so the strategy there appears to be using foreigners, especially Pakistanis, to come into the country and to deliberately attack, especially places like in Kabul and the northern section of the country where people perceive themselves to be safe. Another focus for suicide campaign is probably one that is just starting up, and that is Europe. There's no question that the July 7th, 2005 suicide attacks in London have really caused a lot of ramifications. There were already, prior to that time, a number of different suicide attackers that were either caught or stopped at the very last moment, or who had gone to Iraq to blow themselves up. And so the European security forces, no doubt, are quite worried about this, and almost every month now has some sort of plot that has been uncovered in various different places of Europeans, both Muslims and converts to Islam, that are involved in these sort of things. And so it's very clear that European radical Muslim groups are very anxious to use suicide as a weapon, and probably will continue to do so. Now, beyond that, there are two other groups of suicide attacks that don't usually get much notice in the media, and those are inter-Muslim suicide attacks, especially in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, or in Uzbekistan. These ones do not appear to be focused upon any obvious Western interests, and so are problematic for different paradigms or interpretations of suicide attacks that you find, especially that of Robert Pape, who talks extensively about suicide as being a weapon against occupation and so forth. But they are quite interesting, as I say, for paradigmatic purposes, because oftentimes these sort of suicide attacks, you'll find that people will perfect various different strategies in them and then use them on other people. In Pakistan, almost all of the suicide attacks have been directed against either the leadership of General Parvez Musharraf, who's seen as being hopelessly a a Western subject, as they say in Pakistan, that there's Bush and mush. So, at any rate, so that these two are intertwined in that manner, and so not surprisingly, you find a couple of different assassination attempts on Parvez Musharraf, both of them failures. But in Bangladesh, it seems clear that the suicide attacks were actually directed against to establish a Muslim state. A fairly interesting and abortive attempt. In Uzbekistan, almost certainly because of the repressive regime there. And then the last group deals with just those particular suicide attacks that are targeted assassinations of leaders. It's rather interesting that this hasn't been used against any Western leaders, but obviously there's those against Parvez Musharraf. There's the recent suicide attack attempt against the Prime Minister of Somalia, which was abortive. They're now saying that the attack against Rafiq al-Hariri was a suicide attack, although the evidence is so minimal, apparently only a tooth. And several different other leaders. But it does seem that this is a pattern, perhaps, that will be developed. It's hard to say where that's going. Most of it, as yet, is directed against Muslim leaders. Now, when we look at the profile, again, I must emphasize that that as far as policy considerations, I don't consider profiling to be at all useful in discovering who is going to be a suicide attacker. It's really pretty much been established that just about any group of people, that there's no particular economic status, there's no particular educational status, single or married, excuse me, male or female, and a number of different other things that we would like to use to judge who is likely to be a suicide attacker are simply not going to be operative. Having said that, we still must say that the balance of the suicide attackers is probably going to come from still the younger, unmarried Muslim males or converts. And that's something that we're gradually seeing more and more of, especially during the recent past, that converts are almost always appearing in the lists of people that are caught for attempted suicide attacks or have been able to carry them out. So that's something that we need to consider. Now, motivations are oftentimes hard to identify with regard to suicide attacks. In many cases, among Palestinians, a video is recorded, or a statement, sometimes a last will, a testament, and so forth. And all of these things are published on various different websites. So you can find at least the stated goal of a particular suicide attacker. But having said that, for the vast majority, even of Al-Qaeda and others, there's no particular will or testament that is recorded. And certainly not for the vast majority of the Iraqi suicide attackers. Now, of the Iraqi suicide attackers, as I said, approximately some 540 attacks. There's been isolated about 140 of them that come from other Arab countries. And usually for those people, it's possible to do something of a profile. About 45 to 50% of them, for example, are from Saudi Arabia, and a significant number also from Morocco or Yemen. But they're really taken from all over, and there's no particular profile that you can find that enables you to guess who is likely to be a suicide attacker. So, unfortunately, that's a problem. But we can still guess from some of the statements what are likely to be the motivations. First of all, we have the religious obligation to fight the enemies of God, okay, which appears quite a lot. There's a nationalistic aspect, also, to liberate one's country. There's oftentimes a sense of community empowerment. Okay, especially with regard to the Sunnis of Iraq, a sense of or creating a sense of community, a sense of Sunni identity that might be a counterbalance, for example, to the rise of Shiism. Obviously, revenge is a major factor, especially within occupations. There's oftentimes a very strong sense of humiliation. Among the Palestinians, oftentimes the statement that is left is revenge against a particular Israeli atrocity or a particular Israeli action, killing of some close relative or so forth. So this is, on the most basic level, one has to say that revenge is extremely powerful. And group identification. Okay, group identification. Oftentimes, as I say, that's going to be operative with regard to those converts to Islam, but also to those people who are what we could call reformed Muslims. Okay, and scholars have noticed this that with regard to the profile, let's say, of those suicide attackers that we do know, that a high percentage of them are actually taken from what we could call marginal Muslim groups. Okay, by marginal Muslim groups, I mean that they weren't necessarily identified with any obvious mosque. They were transients, oftentimes those people who had grown up specifically in either more of a secular or a compromised environment. Oftentimes these are people that have even a semi-criminal background, and who have modified their behavior, let's say by a conversion to Islam, either from Christianity or from Hinduism or from any other religion, or from just that more of a secular kind of a non-Muslim identification to a sudden very strong Muslim identification. Sorry. So these people are extremely vulnerable to the likelihood that they could be used as suicide attackers. Okay, and seem to want to sort of cement their group identity to them. I'll give you the example of one figure who oftentimes causes difficulties for paradigms, and that's the Jordanian Raed al-Banna, who carried out what was the most deadly suicide attack in Iraq, some 130 people killed. This is a figure that had actually spent a number of years in the United States, had an almost completely secular education, was a practicing lawyer, a man who was successful in every way. And it's really not very clear why on earth he went to Iraq to pull off this operation. Apparently, it was through an increased sense of Muslim identity, but it's very, very hard to say. No statement was left by him or anything like that. So there can be a very sudden change in the lifestyle that can all of a sudden lead to inclusion in some sort of suicide attack thing. I'd also like to call your attention to what I call romantic suicides. There's a number of different cases where you find either husband or wife or partners will go into suicide operations, especially in Iraq, but also in other places, together and sort of carry out, kind of go into heaven together. So there's there's a lot of different motivations that you find inside, looking inside these groups. Now, support for suicide attacks varies widely. In general, the strongest support that you find in the Muslim world focuses upon the Palestinians, and the vast majority of official ulama or religious leaders of Islam that support suicide attacks usually do specifically within the context of Palestine. And there's a number of different fatwas, which I went over a year ago, that talk about this, the methodology by which this is justified. I just call to your attention a number of the books that I've picked up over the years on suicide attacks. These are, for the most part, representative of mainstream ulama in Islam. Some of them are, some of the people that are cited in there are quite prominent figures. Almost always, people that support suicide attacks within the Palestinian context are very careful to limit their support to only that front. Okay? Now, the problem is with that limitation is that it isn't necessarily efficacious, okay? Because one finds that the same legal logic that is used by these different religious leaders can also be used against the United States, okay? Which is widely seen in the Muslim world as being the supporter, the protector, and in some case maybe even a country that is even being used or is using Israel, depending on how you look at it. And so for radical Muslims that want to expand the field of suicide attacks, oftentimes the arguments, or the same arguments, are used as those that you find in the Palestinian context, but simply then applied to the United States. And probably the best example of that is the book of Imam Samudra, the spiritual leader of the Bali group, who wrote a very influential and kind of interesting and terrifying book, Aku Melawan Terroris. I am not a terrorist. And in it, he cites, he has good knowledge of the Arabic literature and so forth, and he cites actually a couple of these books, most prominently this Amaliyat al-Istishhadiyya fi Mizan al-Fiqh of Takruri, which is really the dominant book in the field. And he notes that Takruri really wants to confine the operations to just Palestinians or maybe Chechens. And in a later edition, then Takruri does mention Iraq. But Imam Samudra very specifically says, he says, these same arguments are actually very useful with regard to Indonesia. and it being invaded or taken over culturally by non-Muslims, especially Australians, but also Americans and so forth, and so can be used to justify suicide attacks in other places. Last year, I pointed out that there's some axes of support as far as the legal literature goes. In general, the Palestinians have received their most close intellectual support from the Egyptian religious establishment. In general, the Chechens have received their most strong support from the Saudi Arabian lower-ranking ulama that have tried to see the Chechen conflict as being a battle between good and evil. And whereas the Iraqis have received an axis of support through Jordan and then to London, where many of the most prominent supporters of their actions are based. Now, the support for martyrdom operations then within the broader society is somewhat nuanced, and it's not always easy to quantify. You have, on the one hand, fairly strong passive support for Palestinian attacks, but this sometimes then diminishes as one starts to ask about attacks beyond the Palestinian arena. Generally, there is some sympathy for attacks against the United States within the context of Iraq, but usually then not much sympathy for attacks against Western civilians, and then it rather diminishes as one goes on to more extreme operations and so forth. In general, one finds that the ulama within the Arabic-speaking world are going to be the most sympathetic to supporting suicide attacks. As one gets out to the peripheries, let's say West Africa, Indonesia, or Central Asia, then there's going to be a severe downturn in support for suicide attacks. And oftentimes, then these ulama are confronted with some inconsistencies in their support. For example, interviewing the religious leadership in Afghanistan, there was broad support for suicide attacks within Palestine, but then when you asked about, let's say, Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was killed by a suicide attacker just before September 11th and September 9th, 2001, who is, to a large degree, the national hero of the northern section of the Afghan peoples. Traveling around in Afghanistan, you see all these different martyrologies of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and they take on very sort of messianic tones. You oftentimes see pictures of Massoud ascending into heaven, or dressed in white, or different things like that. So then asking about these other different types of suicide attacks, or these ones that are then happening in Kabul or in other different cities and stuff, then produces sometimes some anger. This is really not Afghani. But there's no absolute guidelines there that one can see. In general, the attitude is that these types of resistance then are legitimate, but they're not closely defined. The cult of martyrdom is very widely spread, especially on the internet. Personally, I think that books like this are really going out. The last time when I was in Syria, I searched very carefully for Takruri's book, and today you really can't find it. Even places where I bought my copy professes now not to know of its existence, and you really can't find the hardcore literature that you could even a couple of years ago. So it's really clear, at least in my analysis, that this sort of literature has transferred itself pretty much wholesale to the internet. Okay, where you can find and download fatwas, manuals about how to carry out suicide attacks, encouragement, legal justification, and most especially martyrdom videos. Okay, anybody who goes to YouTube or so forth, you can find at least 50 to 75 suicide attack videos many of them against the United States and Iraq. You can watch guys that'll talk to you, and then you watch them as they get in a car and so forth, and then they go and hit an American convoy and so forth, or at least what they say is an American convoy. It's hard to say. But at any rate, so the cult of martyrdom that's built around these sort of things is extremely widespread. Yeah. Okay, the United States and martyrdom operations. Now, the fact is, of course, is the vast majority of those groups are not going to really be problematic for the United States. Most of them have made, in some way or another, some sort of operational decision to avoid any direct attacks upon the United States, most especially groups like Hezbollah or Hamas. Have always been very careful not to attack the United States directly. However, of course, there are certain groups that have not been careful to do that, most especially in Iraq and Iraq and Afghanistan, where we find the issue of the resistance very strongly. But even there, both of these groups usually define themselves against the United States as what they define as occupier, not against the existence of the United States. In other words, their goal, as they state it, is to expel the United States, but not to follow the United States home, let's say. But you do find a number of groups, as I say, those ones that are operative in Europe and Al-Qaeda as a whole, and the groups that it inspires, that actually either oppose the United States in an existential way or are so close to doing so that it really doesn't effectively matter. So how to deal with these groups was really something that we'd like to focus on. Personally, I think that it really is only a matter of time before you do see suicide attacks being carried out here in the United States. And when they happen, it's my strong suspicion that they will happen either through the agency of transients or converts, which are really the two groups that since September 11th and even before have been exposed as being vulnerable to terrorist recruitment. I think it's quite significant and interesting that really you don't find hardly any examples of local first or second generation American Muslims that have actually involved themselves in Al-Qaeda or radical Islam. And so this is actually in quite stark contradistinction to what you find in Europe, where there's a strong movement or an attraction to radical Islam, especially among second and third generation Muslims. Okay, a couple of policy things. And so these are more of a general nature. First of all, I think that it's necessary to know what the limitations of what the Muslim religious elite can do are. And when I started off this research, I really felt that it was necessary for Muslim religious leadership to perhaps issue a fatwa against suicide attacks. Personally, I don't think that would be efficacious anymore. And the reason why is because there's sufficient legal literature and martyrdom literature on the internet now that anybody who really wants to can use it. And I just don't think that there's any way that those people who are likely to carry out a suicide attack are any way going to be affected by a fatwa against suicide attacks. However, I do think that that clerics that are known to be violent or regularly produce fatwas should be held accountable for them. Now, the question of how precisely to do that is not an easy one. Although there are some that are very vulnerable, especially those in Britain or in France and so forth. But the main factory for legal literature of this nature is really Saudi Arabia. And quite a number of, as I say, the lower ranking ulama within Saudi Arabia have not been unwilling, let's just put it that way, to associate themselves with radical materials of this nature. And there's a significant minority of them that are outright either pro-Al-Qaeda or effectively pro-Al-Qaeda. I think that when we look at the issue of humiliation, I think that we can use the idea that the Muslim world feels a profound humiliation as being one of the bases for at least the religious aspect, and in some cases even the nationalistic aspect of suicide attacks. When you look at the fatwas, when you look at the martyrdom literature, that word humiliation is very strong and very and commonly appears. And so, as a policy maker, I have to admit that would be the place where I would start the discourse, is dealing with that sense of that very strong sense of humiliation that the Muslim world, at least a significant percentage of the Muslim world, feels. And I think that when you're looking at the strong, or the places where there is a strong support for suicide attacks, either in the most general sense, like when somebody is asked, do you support suicide attacks, or in a more specific sense, do you support suicide attacks in Palestine or in Iraq, etc., or do you support suicide attacks in a religious sense, then that's really where that's going to come from. There is also the opposing view, most closely associated with Robert Pape, that this is coming most specifically from occupations. Okay, those of you who have read his book, which is very common today, Dying to Win, he proposes the paradigm that occupations, by their very nature, especially when there is some type of religious or cultural divide that is fundamentally unbridgeable, lead to suicide attacks. Now, I don't know that I necessarily agree with every aspect of that analysis. I mean, it does work in certain areas, definitely in Iraq, definitely among Palestinians, and certain different other areas. But it doesn't really answer the question about, for example, Pakistanis, and it doesn't really answer the question of the Indonesians either. And a number of different other things. His definitions of what constitutes Al-Qaeda and what constitutes occupation for Al-Qaeda, I think, are really kind of the weakest sections of the book. His analysis is that occupation for Al-Qaeda means Saudi Arabia. In other words, the United States garrisoning of forces in Saudi Arabia, and that removal of them would then lead to that disappearing. I am not entirely certain of that. As a matter of fact, I strongly feel that the occupation for Al-Qaeda, at least, is really more of a cultural sense rather than a specifically military sense. And that United States relocating, for example, from Saudi Arabia to Qatar, which happened recently, doesn't significantly diminish the danger to the United States at all. Even opposing the issue of profiling, which I do, I think that there are sections of the Muslim population that really do need to be watched. And as I say, and that's a severe problem because, it's very uncomfortable to have to propose something like that. But I think that the sections that are the most likely to produce suicide attackers really are those transitional Muslims, what some people in the intelligence community have called born-again Muslims, which I don't know that I feel entirely comfortable with that terminology, but these are Muslims, as I said, that have made some sort of transition from usually a secular or nominal identification to full religious identification. Usually their religious knowledge of Islam is extremely weak. They're highly manipulable and desperately seeking some sort of community. And obviously, converts would be in the same vulnerable category. And so if one were to watch those particular sections of the Muslim community, it seems to me that would be the most likely to produce suicide attacks. It's been frequently noted, actually, that people that have tended to grow up in a very highly religious Muslim framework actually don't carry out suicide attacks. And so there seems to be a certain inoculation that can happen when one is well grounded in the faith that doesn't happen when one makes a transition, let's say, in later life to becoming more Muslim. Now, also, the issue of the community opposition to suicide attacks. I'd like to focus a little bit of attention upon a pair of suicide attacks that I call one-off. Okay, and those two would be those in Morocco in 2003 and the one in Amman in 2005. Both of these were followed by mass demonstrations against the idea of suicide attacks. And they highlighted that, that there's no understanding within the Muslim community, the broader Muslim community, of the reasons why Muslims need to be killed. Both of those attacks involved fairly heavy civilian casualties against Muslims, and they were rationalized by the people that carried them out, Zarqawi and a local radical Muslim group in Casablanca, as being necessary for the overall war against the United States or against the West and so forth. That message was not accepted by the Muslim community, the broader Muslim community. And I think that there is an element of when, especially like in Amman, where you found this very strong anti-Zarqawi backlash that happened after the Amman attacks in November of last year, that really has severely diminished the support for suicide attacks and al-Qaeda overall within the Kingdom of Jordan. And so there does appear to be some element of public opinion that these people are subject to. Now, having said that, there are certain cases where it appears that the majority of the population really do actually oppose their actions, and they still manage to carry them out. I think that probably Afghanistan is an example. But nonetheless, I think that there is an important role in making sure that the Muslim community actually does massively demonstrate or massively communicate its disapproval of a given operation. Okay, another example of that has happened essentially in Indonesia, where in 2002 you found that the Jemaah Islamiyah had carried out these suicide attacks. Another series of suicide attacks were carried out during the following years, culminating in the last year's attack again upon the island of Bali, whereupon you found the actual former leader of the Jemaah Islamiyah, Abu Bakr Bashir, finally said he denounced this, and he says suicide attacks are simply unacceptable. Now, that is something that we would aspire for Muslims to actually come to that conclusion. It's not an easy conclusion to force upon the Muslim community. It really has to come from within. Any leader who's singled out to say, you should issue a fatwa or you should attack suicide attacks will probably be seen as compromised by the United States or in service to the West. So it really has to come from within. And I do feel that the issue of mobilizing the Muslim community, especially in key places like Great Britain, where you do find a fairly high level of passive acceptance of suicide attacks, is an absolute necessity. And most probably radicals will feed off of social rejection, etc. So with that, I think I'd like to conclude and open up for discussion. And yeah, I don't know how you want to handle that. Okay. So yeah, let's maybe finish off here. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Did the recent remarks of the Pope do a lot of damage in terms of humiliation factor? What's your take on that?
I mean, it could. But I don't know that it's necessarily leading to more humiliation in the sense that it's leading to suicide attacks. No, none that have been carried out so far have emphasized that fact. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there might not be some in the near future that might emphasize it. But that's part of a number of different. I mean, that should be seen within the context of a number of different comments on the part of prominent Western leaders that are fairly negative towards Islam that have been happening in the recent past, kind of a part of a European movement towards, I think, leaving assimilation and appeasement aside. So, yeah.
Israel's controversial wall has stopped a lot of the suicide bombers. Is this? Will you comment on that for other places?
Yeah, I mean, from a strategic point of view, that was basically a decision that probably proved to be the correct one. I can't necessarily say that I condone it absolutely, but from a purely military point of view, it certainly removed the immediate access of the population from Israel. On the other hand, the fact is that the Palestinians, by the time that Israel had begun to build the wall, had already more or less come to the conclusion that suicide attacks were pretty limited in what they could achieve. And I think that from a tactical point of view, they've probably more or less made the decision that suicide attacks are not the way of the future, that using missiles and so forth is probably more efficacious. So in the end, probably the wall will prove to be essentially a waste of money, but it did have an immediate effect. Now the question is whether it would have an effect in any other place. I mean, for example, could the United States build such a thing in Afghanistan or in Iraq? And the answer is no. So it's very limited in its ability to actually translate itself outside of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. I can't think of any other example where it would be helpful for anybody else to build a wall. So, yeah, I think that basically Palestinians already really during 2002, Palestinians, especially Palestinian intellectuals, had noted that suicide attacks were getting them really bad press in the West. And it's very clear that when Israel reoccupied sections of the West Bank, that the protest really throughout the world was very minimal. And I think that really that was due to the bad publicity that the Palestinians were getting because of the suicide attacks. So that's my opinion, though. Yeah.
Why do you think that more Muslim communities haven't already spoken out against these suicide attacks?
I think that it's a number of different kind of converging sort of things. First of all, the Muslim community doesn't necessarily have a single figure that has authority. There's a question and a problem within the Muslim community today of who has the authority to do something. There's the problem of wanting to not be identified necessarily with the United States, most especially not with Bush. And so somebody that is going to do that is going to essentially be, in the eyes of many of his compatriots, saying, well, I'm associating myself with Bush, and nobody wants to do that. So, and there's also a question of who and how. Islam is not a faith where there's some sort of board or hierarchy that can impose something like that. If one within the community that has spiritual prestige is pushing for the possibility of suicide attacks, then if groups of the community follow him, then there's no particular problem. It's not seen as being necessarily something that one has to absolutely reject. So I think that there's a number of different converging sort of things that are causing that. So, yeah.
Following on this idea of the central authority or lack of central authority, Which passages in the authority of the Quran do religious leaders who espouse a violent approach point with greater regularity?
There's a verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second surah of the Quran, that talks about some people sell themselves for God's favor. This is a particular verse that's oftentimes cited in the suicide literature. There's a couple of different other verses that they cite that talk about how many how many small groups have overcome a much larger group. Okay, there's no specific place inside the Quran that actually talks about suicide attacks, and traditionally, I would say that the legal case for supporting them within the context of Islamic law is pretty weak. I mean, really, it would not be that much of a problem if you knew your Islamic law quite well to come up with a pretty significant case against these attacks if you wanted to. I think that pretty much right now the social constraints are the things that are causing kind of some sort of reticence right there. So, yeah.
You mentioned that for one of the policy recommendations as a policy response to suicide attacks was to begin the discourse on the humiliation that the Muslim world or Muslim communities across the world felt. And I guess what I wanted to know was how would that actually translate into an actual policy that could be implemented? In other words, what could the U.S. do to actually reduce the level of humiliation or that prevails within the Muslim communities?
I mean, to me, that has to do with the media approach that we take. I really don't think that. I mean, first of all, the American media in vis-a-vis the Arab world, the Muslim world as a whole, is really at the bottom of the barrel, and it has virtually no credibility. So the one aspect is to deal with the Muslim world with some sense of respect. One aspect has to do with confronting the conspiracy attitude. Now, I'm not entirely certain how to do this because this is such a huge aspect of Middle Eastern and in some cases even Muslim culture that it's not something that you can easily grapple with. But I definitely think that there needs to be more of a focus upon the media, of working with with accepted media outlets that have some sort of credibility within the Muslim world that can pass the message of the United States. But in certain cases, the message of the United States is simply one that's not going to be accepted, and we also have to confront that. The image of our president is hopelessly lost in the Muslim world. And so credibility is not going to stream from the president administration. That's just the fact. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be a long-term media campaign to increase the image of the United States and better it in future years. But there also has to be an aspect of working within the Muslim community. I mean, some of the stuff that you read from this literature, to me, sounds frankly incredible. The amount of feeling of this sense of humiliation that seems to me to be very highly exaggerated. And, some of it is, of course, rhetorical, but others of it, you just wonder whether you can ever talk to some of these audiences and stuff. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it seems to me that one of the, from your talk, one of the central points you made over and over again is that the Palestinian issue, more than any other issue, has salience across the Muslim world. Mm-hmm. So I'm surprised that one of your policy prescriptions is not that the U.S. should end the occupation of the Palestinians and take that capital away or take that issue off the table entirely and gain the U.S. a tremendous credibility, which, as you say, it does not have. So shouldn't that be one of the policy prescriptions? End the occupation, cut off support for Israel, force Israel to comply with international law, and thereby win over the vast majority of the Muslim world, including the Palestinians, who you say are the most important issue. I'm surprised that that's not one of the policy prescriptions.
Okay, well, it's not one of the policy prescriptions because I can't really quantify it in the sense that you're talking about. I mean, I can support the end of the occupation. And I think that in general, American policy has leaned towards that, although not necessarily that of Bush. But I think that it did lean towards that direction in the Clinton years. And so I'm left with a question about what constitutes the end of the occupation. To cut off support for Israel, I don't think that's necessarily going to be something that would be in the United States' benefit. But I do, on the other hand, think that there should be some sort of equitable settlement for the Palestinian population. I'm just not sure what precisely would be the form that would take that would actually lead to the end of that grievance. And the reason why I have a problem with that is because there's many. There's somewhat of an ambiguity. Some groups really believe that a Palestinian state, if it appears upon the areas that were taken over by Israel in 1967, with the capital in Jerusalem, that will constitute the end of the occupation. But that isn't necessarily certain. And because I haven't really been able to grasp what exactly is the end right there, I can't really go any further with that. To me, it seems like an issue just like the United States occupation of Saudi Arabia. I don't know what the end of that is. You know, whether the United States could withdraw, let's say, militarily from Saudi Arabia, but it remains some sort of, in some way or another, culturally occupying it. Does withdrawal mean, for example, that all United States dependents and so forth need to leave Saudi Arabia? If there was some sort of exact definition to what constitutes the occupation of Palestine, I would definitely go for it. I would definitely support it. But I just don't think that it's necessarily in the United States' interest to take very extreme measures against Israel, such as cutting off support. But on the other hand, I'm not sure whether the United States would achieve any goals if it didn't. So I do understand what you're saying. I have to admit that that's an ambiguity and confusion in my own mind. So, yeah.
I can't speak for Muslims outside of North America, but there are groups in the U.S., such as the Council of American Islamic Relations, who've convened the local scholars here, at least on a national level, and they've come out and they've made fairly bold statements about these operations, the suicide bombings and so on, speaking against it. Obviously that message is not being heard. So, I mean, how do you recommend fixing that? Because they've gone out to center stage, holding CNN press conferences and whatnot, and obviously that has not been heard.
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim community inside the United States has made those efforts, and in other places as well, Great Britain also, and in Turkey. There's been several different very prominent ulama in Turkey that have issued fatwas and so forth. I think that those groups are seen as hopelessly compromised, and they don't have the spiritual authority. The Muslim community inside the United States really is very divided. It doesn't have any spiritual authority within the larger Muslim community. It is not known as being the home of, let's say, the ulama. Most of the ulama here are badly trained. They're foreign, etc. They don't really have any local prestige. So I don't think that it's likely that those people are going to have an effect. That's just a fact. In the same way with Turkey. So, yeah.
In your opinion, which Western leader has the most influence on the frequency or the occurrence of suicide attacks?
I mean, in the negative sense, no doubt Bush. But is that what you meant?
No, the opposite of that. Which Western leader is thought of as the most influential, not the least influential?
Oh, you meant the most influential in the sense of speaking to the Muslim world? Probably Jacques Chirac, I guess. That's a guess. I don't know that I've ever seen any particular materials on that subject. So, yeah.
Is there any scientific attempt to identify the training camps in all these places?
Today, there's not a prominent use of training camps. I mean, there's a few training camps that exist in parts of Indonesia, and perhaps now in Somalia. not certain of that at all. But you know, those training camps that exist, for example, in Pakistan, are very difficult to identify. I've talked to Pakistani military and so forth, and at least they profess not to be able to identify that sort of thing. So, but I don't think that the issue of training camps necessarily today is that important as it was during the Taliban rule of Afghanistan. So.
You mentioned that there's disparity regarding the views in regards to suicide attacks between first and second generation American Muslims and first and second generation Europeans, such as British. Why do you think that's the case?
A very high degree of alienation that happens in Britain. I think that the assimilative process of American Muslims has been much more successful. The tendency to ghettoize, but you know, I don't have a final answer, to be absolutely frank, because there's ghettoization here too. Dearborn and parts of LA and so forth are effectively ghettoized as well. I don't know. I really don't know what the actual basis of that is, but definitely the radicalization of British Muslims is much higher degree. Perhaps it has to do with more of a cultural unity that you find among British Muslims. Most of them are Pakistani or South Asian in origin, whereas you find that American Muslims are all over the board, really from just about every Muslim country. And so there's really no particular overall cultural unity, but I don't know where to go beyond that. So, yeah, okay.
In children's religious education in countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, are these issues discussed? And if so, how early?
You mean either in support or opposition to martyrdom operations?
Yeah.
Not to the best of my knowledge. No, they're not addressed. No.
Until later on.
Yeah, this is material that's usually that you usually find people becoming acquainted with as they become teenagers, etc. Yeah, it's much more kind of a coming of age sort of thing. Yeah.
I have a hard time being a Westerner, but as a young teenager growing up in the Middle East, I mean, is the imams and the mosques, how do you recruit somebody that wants to take their part to enter into martyrdom by blowing themselves up?
I mean, there's one school of thought that says that they need to be recruited. Today, most people have come to the conclusion they don't actually need to be recruited. They can just go to the internet and find their own way. But having said that, they can. There are various different contact people. There's mosques that are known in every place that are known to be radical. For example, the Bin Nouri Mosque in Karachi. You can just go there and get associated with some radical group within a few minutes, and they will get you in touch with the people that you need to know, and gradually train you and kind of weed you out, find out which ones are kind of the more psychologically vulnerable, etc. The same way with Indonesia, the Mukmin Pesantren is well known to be the place where you went if you wanted to become a martyr. And so basically the martyrs that you find in Indonesia are almost all associated with that particular Pesantren. So there's different contact places that you can find. Also on the internet, they'll put you in touch with people.
Have you ever looked at any comparisons between this group of martyrdoms and like in World War II, the kamikaze pilots that, were destined to take their lives? I mean, is there any common theme there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that probably the common theme would come with sort of a nationalistic religious desperation. Probably it would be best seen as something like the Chechens, or maybe in certain cases the Palestinians. But there have been some comparative studies, but not that many. Usually I've seen the kamikazes dealt with aside, not in a comparative sense. So, yeah.
Last thing, would you say this would have been a much more diminished phenomena had certain events such as Iraq not happened?
There's no question about it. Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I would have never in my life guessed that so many suicide attacks would have happened in Iraq. I mean, even as a scholar looking at the material, I am amazed at the pure prevalence and the ingenuity of all these different suicide attacks. It's one of my friends is working on the subject of Iraqi suicide attacks, and I mean, there's just so much material. So it literally the competition. There's no comparison. Even with Palestinians, there's no comparison. Yeah.
Do you think there would have been more suicide attacks in the United States if it weren't for these wars that we have in the Middle East?
Yeah, hypothetical is very difficult to answer. I mean, I mean, since Al-Qaeda basically had already decided upon attacking the United States, I think that there's that clearly Al-Qaeda would have continued to attack no matter whether we had attacked Iraq or Afghanistan. But having said that, I think that their pool of recruits is much wider because of the involvements in Iraq and Afghanistan. So other than that, I don't know how far to take a hypothetical like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, just a quick question. You mentioned that their recruitment happens like within mosques and also over the internet. Can you give me an idea of like what percentage happens over the internet and what percentage happens within a mosque?
To date, the vast majority is through mosque or personal association. The internet stuff is most interesting not because of its quantity, but because of the idea, which is starting to fascinate terrorism experts, that you can build a terrorist from scratch without knowing anybody. And that he can carry out his entire mission without actually ever having any contact with anybody. Okay, and so this is something that's kind of going around the security world right at the moment. But to date, it really hasn't been that prominent. I mean, in terms of pure numbers, you have a couple of examples. That guy at the University of North Carolina that tried to commit suicide and kill a bunch of students and stuff, Tahir Ozeri. He didn't really succeed because he didn't really drive his car in the right way. But I mean, he definitely tried, and so I mean, it seems to at least to the experts that I rely upon, that might be a wave of the future, at least within the United States and Europe. That these people don't necessarily need the ideological connection of some sort of little, comfortable nest and so forth. They just need to get on the internet and so forth and build themselves a bomb, etc. Yeah.
Two more.
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned at the beginning that a large percentage of the total suicide operations are carried out in Sri Lanka.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think there's been so little American attention focused on that, as opposed to so much attention focused on the attacks that are generated through Islam?
United States interests. I mean, basically, we don't really have any interests in Sri Lanka, and the conflict is not one that is easily understood by Americans. But I mean, fundamentally, Americans don't really pay much attention to anything that happens outside the wall. Yeah. So in my classes, I'm continually reminded of that for those of my students who are here. But yeah, I mean, it's just a fact that Americans don't pay any attention. I don't know how much Americans really and seriously pay attention to what goes on in Iraq. I think that in general, Americans have the impression that things are going badly, but I don't know that they necessarily realize how badly or how deadly the place is. And, how many people really know what's going on in Afghanistan? Yeah, I'll bet that's a pretty exclusive club. So, at any rate. Okay, so any other questions? Yeah.
You probably touched on this throughout your talk. I was wondering if you could summarize. So you've talked about the drivers of these suicide attacks, humiliation, occupation, these various things. So what I would like to know is what sets aside these radical Muslim groups from other groups that have also experienced humiliation and occupation and not conducted wide-scale suicide attempts.
And that's the point where I have a difficulty with Pape's thesis. about occupation. I mean, there's certain different issues like that that raise the question about whether Muslims might be more susceptible to something like this. And I mean, that's raised with regard to, let's say, the way that the ANC campaigned against the apartheid regime, let's say in South Africa. Okay, a very strong sense of humiliation, and certainly a sense of occupation.
One more thing.
And yet, there was not that use of suicide attacks. On the other hand, there have been definitely places where Muslims have felt occupation and humiliation, such as, let's say, Afghanistan when the Soviet Union controlled it, that there were no suicide attacks. And so, you know, you don't ever seem to be able to find one theory that covers all the bases. And I don't have an answer for what precisely is the common denominator. I would say that humiliation can tend to cause that, but I can't say that it's the sole or isolated as the sole contributing factor. Just the same way as I can say that in many cases occupation does engender it, but there's also equally a lot of places where it doesn't. And where there do seem to be some sort of fundamental divides, yet there's no suicide attacks. So theories don't work out very well with this. Okay, well, thank you very much.